Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is collaboration between community-based organizations and state energy agencies, findings and lessons from the Solar with Justice project. We have an excellent panel of guest speakers with us today, but before we pass it over to them, I'd like to go over some webinar logistics. We are using a newly updated version of GoToWebinar. If you have any feedback for us, we welcome you to put that in our post-webinar survey. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your webcam and microphone are disabled. You can submit questions and comments via the questions panel. The speaker bios are available in the materials section on your webinar console, and captions are available with the button on your panel. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a recording within 48 hours. It's also available on our website at CESA.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over for our host for today, Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Zareen. And if we could have the next slide. Before we get into the meat of today's session, let me tell you a little bit about the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national membership organization, and we have members across the country. Most of our members are state energy agencies. We have members in about 20 states, and they collectively help us set priorities and decide what we're going to do as an organization. If we can go to the next slide. You could see a slide with our various members here. And if you're from an organization that isn't on here and you represent a state energy agency especially, we'd love to have you join our membership ranks. If we could go to the next slide. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the Solar with Justice project, which is a project that has focused for the past 3 years on connecting states and communities. And what we've been trying to do is to identify models for how state energy agencies and community-based organizations can collaborate more effectively to expand access to solar in ways that bring its benefits to low-income and disadvantaged communities. And the project has been going on for several years. And if we go to the next slide. Oh, we seem to be having some slide problems here. So let me talk about what would be on the next slide instead. And that is to say that we've produced a wide range of publications, here we go, and resources through the Solar with Justice project. We've done reports based on a national survey of community-based organizations, and you're going to find out more about that later in this webinar. We've done 6 case studies, 5 of them on partnerships between states and community-based organizations, and a 5th one on the specific issues involved with states working with tribal nations. We've done 5 video interviews, including with the various speakers you'll be seeing today. We have a public national database of community-based organizations. We have additional resources and guidance. And all of this is to help encourage both states and community organizations to work together and work together more effectively. We're going to have 3 presentations today. I'm going to be doing the first one. It'll be a short presentation. We'll then be hearing from Janelle Knox-Hayes from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and then from BioWare from Energy Trust of Oregon. And I'll tell you more about them when it's time for their presentations. But in the meantime, if you can't wait to hear more about them, You can go on your screen and look under materials where you'll see bios today of all the speakers. But now I'm going to go into my presentation, which if we could have the next slide, we're starting that presentation, which is, here we go. It's going to focus on recommendations for solar with justice. We've produced a short paper with 7 key recommendations. I'm going to talk about that at the moment, and you can go and access the paper as you can see on this screen here. If we could go to the next slide. Before I talk about the recommendations, I want to give you a little bit more information about the Solar with Justice project. And the current version of the project began in 2021 and it ends this month. It's been funded in great part by the US Department of Energy, but we've also had additional funding. And the project team has consisted of representatives of the organizations you can see listed on the slide, including the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning and Energy Trust of Oregon, both of which you'll be hearing from in a little bit. And one of the things that also helped this project, in addition to having a strong project team, is the fact that we had a very helpful advisory committee consisting of environmental justice experts, energy equity advocates, and state energy officials. And you could see the list of the advisory committee members on your screen there. One of the important things to note about the Solar with Justice project is that partway through it, in 2022, the landscape for low-income solar changed dramatically. It changed with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, and later with President Biden's executive order establishing the Justice 40 initiative. Those things sharpened the focus on solar for disadvantaged communities, and they brought new urgency and funding to the table. It became more important to include community-based organizations in the solar development process, and there were now new resources for doing that. But the states were also frequently stretched thin by the IRA funding deadlines and by all the hoops they needed to jump through to participate in IRA programs. Nevertheless, in general, the topic of the Solar with Justice project, the topic of coordination and collaboration between state energy agencies and community-based organizations, or CBOs, became more important. If we go to the next slide, we started this project with 3 starting premises. First, for solar energy to serve all Americans equitably and to retain strong public support, it's essential to overcome the considerable barriers that make it difficult for low-income and other disadvantaged households to share in the financial benefits of solar development. Secondly, solar programs for underserved communities should actively involve trusted community organizations. Those organizations can ensure that the programs meet communities' needs, empower community voices, and overcome some of the distrust that many residents feel towards utilities, solar companies, and the government. And then thirdly, state governments and state energy agencies in particular play a crucial role in developing and implementing solar programs, but to effectively reach underserved communities, they need to collaborate with trusted community organizations. And we go to the next slide, you'll see our 7 general recommendations. Now, this only scratches the surface of what we've come up with through the Solar with Justice project, and many of the reports and videos and webinars and guides we've put out have much more detailed advice and information. But these are some general points we think are important to bear in mind when thinking about how community-based organizations and state energy agencies can work together. First of all, you need to recognize capacity constraints. Most community-based organizations are small and they have limited funding and they have many demands on their time. State energy agencies and other stakeholders should develop those plans with those constraints in mind. They should make it easy for CBOs to participate in the solar development process, and they should find ways to expand those organizations' internal capacity. In turn, community representatives should recognize that state energy agencies have their own constraints. Those constraints include limited financial resources, staff with multiple responsibilities, and regulations that can prevent them from offering certain types of assistance. CBOs and state energy agencies should make their specific constraints and limitations known because those challenges may not be obvious to others. Second recommendation is to understand the CBO landscape. CBOs vary greatly in their mission, size, resources, longevity, and geographic scope. It's useful to do research to understand which CBOs are active in a geographic area and what they're working on. States can use that knowledge to inform their outreach strategies. In turn, CBOs can use that information to shape coalition building and group action. Now, some of the work products, as you'll be hearing about in a few minutes after I'm done with my presentation, some of the work products from the Solar with Justice project can help people understand the CBO landscape. Our third recommendation is to provide multiple forms of assistance to CBOs. States should provide a range of assistance, including financial support, compensation to cover time spent engaging with state agencies, educational resources, direct technical assistance, and training. To help CBOs navigate state government bureaucracies, it's good to provide them with a single point of contact. The fourth point, treat community outreach and engagement as an ongoing process. Ideally, states should start to engage communities early in the process of developing a solar program, especially given the potential for IRA-funded initiatives to transform and expand the market for low-income solar. It's important for CBOs to be brought into the program planning process during the early stages of program development. And then additional CBOs can be included over time as more of them are identified. Now, there's inevitably going to be cases where outreach does not start early in the process for a variety of reasons, or where engagement does not proceed as easily as planned. However, everyone should anticipate that the engagement process will be complicated. It's going to involve challenges. True collaboration can take time. Success should be judged on whether there's been progress over time, not whether everything worked perfectly from day one. Fifth point, think beyond income levels. Focusing on low-income solar is very important. It's a crucial metric in terms of figuring out which communities to target, but it's not the only factor. For example, African American communities have often been targeted for siting of the most polluting fossil fuel infrastructure. Tribal nations in rural areas have often been left out from clean energy benefits. It's important to think about these different types of disadvantaged communities when figuring out where to target programs to make sure that solar is developed equitably. Sixth point, make community-based organizations allies for protecting solar consumers. Residents of low-income and other disadvantaged communities have frequently been the targets of unscrupulous businesses, and solar has not been immune from this pattern. As solar development has become a real possibility for disadvantaged communities, deceptive advertising and consumer scams have been following. We should recognize that community-based organizations are a valuable resource. They have boots on the ground. They can identify and report on deceptive practices that are popping up in their community. They can identify the consumer education that residents need, and they can help to deliver that education. The final point is that one size does not fit all. There are significant differences across states and regions in terms of electricity markets, in terms of solar programs, energy policies, and even the landscape of CBOs varies from region to region and state to state. Strategies for collaboration, therefore, need to vary based on location. So that's my introductory presentation. If you have questions, put your questions in the question box, and we're going to have our next two presentations, and then we'll get to questions for any of the speakers. Let me introduce our second speaker, who's going to be Janelle Knox-Hayes from MIT. She's been a great partner for this project, and she's spearheaded much of the research that was done. She's the Lister Brothers Associate Professor of Economic Geography and Planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, and she holds a visiting research fellowship at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University. So Janelle, you're on.
Yes. Thanks so much, Horn. And I don't know if we're having a screen change here to show my slides.
Yeah. There we go.
Excellent. So, and I apologize, everyone. I have a sick child at home with me. If you hear a lot of screaming in the background, please don't be alarmed. So the title of this presentation is U.S. Community-Based Organizations and Their Relationship to Solar Energy Development. And I just wanted to quickly go over a quick highlight of the report that we released last month, and then I think we can have a more interactive discussion after with the presentations. So if we go on to the next slide, we can just take a quick look at what this survey was. It's basically the design was shaped from our previous part of the study, which was interviews with various community-based organizations working across the 50 US states. We had workshops, focus groups, discussions with the CBOs and state energy representatives, and then we used this to structure typologies of the CBOs, and then built our survey instrument off of the typology and what we had learned from these various engagements to really get a better understanding about how the organizations operate, the challenges they're facing, the strategies they're deploying, and then what that looks like across different regions. So if we go on to the next slide, we can take a look at kind of the structure of the survey itself. The first part really focused on the solar work and what that meant. In our interviews, we found that CBOs tend to be either what we called solar focused, that's the primary mission and objective of the work of the organization itself. Fewer of our organizations actually have this structure, and then there's solar adjacent, meaning that they're doing work in the solar arena, but it's ancillary or it's secondary to their primary mission and objective. And then, of course, there are those organizations that are not working in the solar field, but that are very interested or that might see future possibilities. The second part of the survey was about the opportunities and challenges the organizations faced. And then the third, context and motivations for the solar-related work if they're engaged in solar-related work. And the fourth was the level of solar knowledge, both of the organization and of the communities they serve. And then fifth, the general organizational focus, what aspect of solar work they're working on and how that plays out. And then finally, we got really good demographic data, both about the organization structure, composition, tenure, as well as the individuals serving within the organization. And we've done some preliminary analysis of how those different demographics affect their solar work and their solar function. So if we go on to the next slide. Can we go on to the, yeah, there we go. We'll take a quick look at the summary statistics and one more slide. Yeah, here we go. So we have this series of maps in the report, and this is kind of just a nice way to get a very good snapshot of what's happening in every region. So the first figure here on the left just shows the averages across all of the CBOs that we surveyed for organization tenure, how long they're operating. The predominant form is 10 plus years, so most of these are long-term organizations. The primary area of work, as I said before, is solar adjacent. Paid employees, this kind of shows most of the organizations are small, 1 to 5 paid employees. And then the legal structure, the predominant legal structure is nonprofit, although as we'll see later in the results, there's actually some really interesting results around other legal structures. Scale of funding, with IRA and BIL out, this is actually really important that most of the organizations are relying on foundation grants. They're not, for whatever reason, tapping into national state funds. And so I think making sure that those mechanisms are operative and that the most of these organizations have access because they're directly serving LMI and other frontline communities is a really important facet. And then scale of work, the majority are working in the regional metropolitan area. And then so we have broken out into 5 regions. So on the next figure, figure 10, you see the regional analysis for the Midwest. And again, a lot is familiar here. Scale of funding is the foundation grants. Organization tenure is very similar, 10 or more years. Nonprofit is the predominant group in this region. The thing that's, one of the areas where you'll see quite a bit of difference is primary area of work. Here in the Midwest, community awareness, building community awareness is a big area of focus. And the other thing to notice is the state solar support. This is an area that perceives a lot of state solar support or feels the states are very pro-solar. So if we go on to the next slide, we can compare this with some of the other regions. All right, so here we're looking at the Northeast and the Southeast for comparison. Again, the Northeast is also going to have a lot of state solar support, but when you look at that primary area of work, solar project development is a bigger focus here, and there's different reasons that plays out. Also, a lot of volunteer capacity, more than most of these organizations have more than 16 volunteers. That seems to be a really important factor in how they're operating and what type of work they're able to carry out. And then some of the other things, solar project development is a big area of focus, but some of the other things are also similar to other regions. Scale of work rather than regional metropolitan, which is common for a lot of the other regions, neighborhood. So local and focused on project development in the Northeast. In the Southeast, here you can kind of see some of the same trends. A lot of small organizations, 1 to 5 paid employees. A lot of volunteers in the Southeast as well, more than 16 for most organizations. The primary area of work here, though, is different. It's going to be focused on policy advocacy. And then, the pro-solar support, not as strong as the Northeast, but still a sense of solar support here. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll look at 2 more regions. Here we have Southwest and West. And unfortunately, we didn't have a huge sample size from Southwest. So for different aspects of the analysis, we ended up having to combine regions just so we statistically could work around the small sample size for the Southwest. But even still, there's some interesting findings. A primary area of work here is also on community awareness. It's a small sample size, but a big feeling of a lack of solar support from the states in this region. In the West, in contrast, you see, again, a really high sense of pro-solar support. The primary area of work is on community awareness here as well. And what's interesting about the West, and maybe this reflects just the scale of the geography of the West, but the scale of work is much larger. It's statewide scale of work. And perhaps related to that, the number of employees, these organizations are also a lot bigger. They tend to be 16 or more paid employees in the organization. And then, of course, also having really big volunteer capacity. And then, across all of these regions, predominant type is 10 or more years for these organizations. All right, next slide. So what we did with the different, the survey had just so much information, such a depth of data. I feel we haven't still even fully mined it, but one of the ways we tried to get around the really detailed questions was to do factored analysis. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll just take a quick look at what this looks like. It allowed us to take, a lot of the first set of four factors here deal with awareness. So there were a lot of questions about what the organization perceived or how familiar they were with different programs, with different aspects of energy independence, of green finance. And we were able to scale those factors, scale those variables, create factors to analyze how closely they were correlated. So variables that were very closely correlated, we were able to create an index or a scaled variable to kind of measure a composite or maybe something that's beneath all of the variables. So for example, in the first column here, or the first row, energy independence awareness. So this is comprised of a series of 5 underlying variables. So access to a resilience hub, familiarity with solar tax credits, familiarity with low income programs, familiarity with energy independence, and familiarity with energy burden. And when we combine these, it creates an index that shows the degree to which an organization is familiar with and focused on energy independence. This will contrast. So you can kind of take a look at the 8 index variables we created: green finance awareness, degree of CBO involvement in communities served, degree of community solar awareness, communication for solar awareness, which shows the degree to which organizations focus on building trust, communication strategies, and capacity to raise awareness for residential solar programs. And then, motivation, community energy, sovereignty is a primary focus of what the organization's doing. Workforce installation scale, which is differentiated from solar work depth. So workforce installation scale shows the degree to which an organization is focused on workforce training and solar installation in their communities. So that's sort of installation and training, whereas depth of solar work shows the degree to which an organization is focused on the actual solar installation project specifically and the level of experience they have with doing that. So if we go on to the next slide, what we'll do is just quickly take a look at, we mapped these variables across the regions, and this is really interesting. It kind of shows some of the regional differences that we might see. So here we instead of just using the five major regions we used in the first set of analysis, we broke this out into the DOE regions, and we mapped across 12 different regions. So here, for example, for energy independence, how much of a focus that is, you can see it's really important in Intermountain West and the Southwest, and the Northeast, less important in the West and the Southeast. Green finance awareness is really important in the West, the Southwest, and the Northeast, and then less important in the South and Southeast. Communication for solar awareness. This is interesting. We map, both organizations trying to communicate, trying to build trust within their communities, and where that was really important, which was different from how the community solar awareness is actually measuring how much solar awareness there is within the community, at least as perceived by the CBO. And so communication for solar awareness was a big focus in the West, the Southwest, the Southeast. But interestingly, you can kind of see that despite that focus, and when you look at the community solar awareness scale, that focus doesn't show up as strongly in what the community, how effective they've been in communicating within these regions. And then if we go on to the next page, so this first set of factors looked at all of the kind of different awareness questions. We have more of the motivation and involvement, and then also the different kind of scales of work. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of similarity in between motivation, community energy sovereignty. This is kind of a big focus for many of the regions, but particularly West, South, Southwest, Midwest, Southeast. And then, not as strong in the Intermountain West, but that had fewer organizations that were surveyed. Again, it's also maybe a difference of energy access in that region. And then when you look at degree of CBO involvement in the community served, there's also some correlation here. Strong involvement in the West, the Southwest, the Midwest, and the Mid-Atlantic, and also the Southeast, even though that's kind of a level lower. For whatever reason, that's not the community involvement isn't as strong in the South. With the workforce installation scale, Southwest, a lot of installation there. The Northeast, this may be responsive to what's otherwise happening in the region, funding that's available, state incentives, et cetera. And then just the depth of solar work. There's likewise a lot of solar work depth, probably as a consequence in both the Northeast and the Southwest, but also in the Intermountain West, and then Midwest and West are quite strong, whereas in the Southeast, less depth of solar work. So again, the Southeast is a good place where you kind of see the difference between workforce installation, big emphasis on workforce and, kind of community training, community building. That was also the policy advocacy that we saw in the Southeast, and then, less actual depth of solar work in the Southeast. All right, if we go on to the next slide. We then did some statistical regression analysis to test the different relationships across these factors. So we'll take a quick look at the overview of what this looked like. If we go to the next slide, yeah. So here you see like all of the awareness variables or the awareness indices, index variables tested. And we did kind of a regional analysis, scale of work, legal structure, organization staff, paid employees, volunteers, solar support, and looked at the relationship with a regression analysis across these variables. So here resides in community is actually, one of the strong predictive variables that has a strong correlation, inverse correlation, showing that organizations that reside in community are less likely to have the strong sense of energy independence, green finance awareness, or even focus on communication for solar awareness. And this may be less about being close to the community and more about signaling something about the scale of CBO that is residing within the community, the scale of resources they have, the staff capacity, et cetera. Fiscally sponsored nonprofit, this is a positive factor in determining communication for solar awareness, where that's a really big focus. Most of the organizations, as we said, are more than 10 years. There's also, a few organizations in this 1 to 5 year category. 6 to 10 years, though, is a really big, there's something about that tenure, that timeline for having a big community awareness capacity within the within the communities that are served. And then, of course, perceiving state support seems to be really significant in predicting that community awareness. So if we go to the next page, we'll just take a quick look at some of the statistical results for the other 4 index variables. And here are a lot of significant results for the motivation, involvement, and then the different types of workforce installation or depth of solar work variables, where the regions are really important. You're seeing kind of negative correlations for motivation, energy sovereignty in the Southwest and West. It's not that the way to interpret these, each of the regions are measured against the baseline, which is our largest region, Midwest. So it's not necessarily that energy sovereignty isn't a focus there. It's less statistically less of a focus than it is in the Midwest. Degree of community involvement relative to the Midwest is less in the Northeast and West. And then, depth of solar work is less in the Southeast. And that's probably not surprising when we think about the way we saw the mapped characteristics. Scale of solar work, there is some interesting relationship across these variables with the scale of work, with the statewide organizations and the neighborhood organizations. Kind of, a lot of our organizations are working in this regional metro municipal scale. Those that are working locally and those that are working at a higher scale seem to have more community involvement. Workforce installation, less installation though at the statewide and municipal scale relative to other scale, which was our baseline. Legal structure seems to be an important factor across several of the variables, but what was really interesting is this depth of solar work. Other legal structure, so not nonprofit, cooperative, for-profit, or fiscally sponsored nonprofit, was really significant for predicting or correlating with the depth of solar work. So we can't list those results because it is confidential, but we have the list of organizations that fell into that category. And what we're trying to do is some additional research to understand what those legal structures look like and why they're so significant in predicting this depth of solar work. Organization staff seem to be really important. Again, this resides in community is a negative predictor. We suspect that's more about the kind of staff capacity that organizations that are really close to or residing in the community might have. Has Indigenous staff as a really significant predictor for being motivated towards energy sovereignty, having a huge or a large degree of community involvement. And then, paid employees, it didn't seem to be statistically significant across any of these factors, but the volunteers were. So there seems to be a relationship between, this volunteer range of 6 to 15, the organizations that have that, or sorry, rather those with volunteers that are, in the 1 to 5 range or 16 or more have less feeling of a degree of involvement in the communities that they serve. This may, as we saw in the mapping, the first set of maps, it may be that those with 16 or more are just working at a much larger scale. They're not really neighborhood or municipality focused. Workforce installation also, this kind of category here of 11 to 15 on volunteers seems to be a sweet spot for success with workforce installation. And then depth of solar work, the 6 to 10 organizations are less likely to have a strong depth of solar work. So some interesting results, and we kind of spend more time in the report talking through each of these and what they might mean. So if we go on to the next slide, we just have some final concluding thoughts to summarize across each of these index variables. And one more slide. If we could go on to, final slide. Yeah, so energy independence awareness seems to underscore the pivotal role of volunteer engagement in CBO efforts to address energy independence. It suggests that there should be some policy focus on volunteer-based volunteer-based solutions, and helping to think about how significant that role is for these organizations. Green finance awareness highlights the importance of CBO familiarity with green finance in addressing energy burden effectively, which suggests maybe thinking about resource allocation to green finance focused organizations for mitigating energy burden, but also that resources to help build that financial literacy and capacity to engage for organizations. Communication for solar awareness shows the degree to which the organization perceives it's built trust, communication strategies, and capacity to raise awareness for residential solar programs. And the emphasis on communication seems to be particularly significant for organizations operating at the municipal and multi-state scale, and for those that are fiscally sponsored nonprofits. So really important, I think, to think about how the organizations are communicating, why and where they're communicating, and how that can be built. And then there seems to be some relationship with this degree of community solar awareness. It shows that the desire to communicate effectively is not necessarily translated for all of the solar programs and benefits in the communities. This is an area that most regions could build, especially the Southeast. For-profit organizations are more likely to be serving communities with stronger solar awareness, so that may also be a question about where and how resources are being distributed. And then motivation of energy sovereignty. This shows that organizations in the Midwest have the highest motivation for energy sovereignty. There's also, as we saw, and that may be both kind of endogenous and exogenous, a really big focus on solar projects and solar development in the Midwest. Organizations that focus at the municipal level and organizations where respondents reside in the community are less likely to be motivated by energy sovereignty, and those organizations are likely focused on other goals. And then interestingly, I think something to probe further is this: organizations with Indigenous staff are more likely to be motivated by energy sovereignty. We tended in the report to say everything should be caveated because we don't have a huge sample size. I think our total sample size is 150, but by the time you eliminate non-responses for some of the variables, we're looking at probably 80 responses for each of these index variables. So it's not a huge sample size, and there's definitely, it's worth doing additional work to test or to refine these results. But that House Indigenous staff was significant. More than, I think, 33 organizations indicated that they had Indigenous staff. So it wasn't a really small variable in the analysis, and there's definitely something significant there. And as you know, a lot of really important work being done on tribal lands in the renewable space. Degree of CBO involvement in communities served, it emphasizes the degree of community involvement across learning, trust building, and communication with the communities served. The workforce installation scale shows the scale of work, legal structure, and volunteer capacity have an impact on the focus of workforce development and solar installation. So nonprofits and cooperatives are less likely to be engaged in workforce installation, whereas organizations that have more substantial volunteer staff are more likely to be engaged. And again, that kind of makes sense. These variables may signal a capacity issue, that either there's a lot of reliance on volunteers because the paid capacity isn't there within the organizations, or it may be a factor that having these large volunteer organizations really helps think about community engagement, building workforce capacity, and other kind of levels of community support. And then finally, depth of solar work. It highlights the lower levels of installation in the southeast, whereas the maps indicate a greater focus in the southwest and northeast, and then also the Midwest. The statistically significant relationship between other legal structures and higher rates of solar installation points to the need to further investigate the types of organizations that are successful in building a depth of solar work, as well as the kinds of legal structural challenges that may create obstacles. And finally, organizations that reside in the community. This is really interesting because it was opposite of what we would have expected, but it may indicate that they have moderate size volunteer capacity, and are likely to have experience and emphasis on solar installation, but it may have an impact on some of the other factors where we want these organizations to succeed. All right, so that's a big snapshot overview of the report, and I want to, for the sake of time, I know I've run over a little bit, I'll conclude here, and then we can save maybe for some questions after the next presentation. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Janelle. So as you can see, this was a very rich survey with lots of information in it. We actually have 4 different reports that came out of it. One is the major report with the detailed statistical findings on tenure of the organization's regional differences, etc. We have another report that focuses on the attitudes and experiences of CBOs with solar. We have just a summary of the regional findings. And finally, and what might be your best spot for starting out and what to read first and then go on to the other reports, we have a short document with the key takeaways from the other reports based on this very rich survey. So thanks very much, Janelle. But we're going to go on to our third speaker. And I'm pleased to introduce Bayo Ware, who's project manager on the renewables team at Energy Trust of Oregon. His role there focuses on community-focused projects, such as management of the BIPOC Solar Ambassadors pilot. Energy Trust of Oregon has been a real national leader in finding ways to reach out to and work with community-based organizations. And one of the things we've tried to do with the Solar with Justice project, in addition to doing the types of broad-scale research that Janelle was talking about, was to do case studies where we really learn about the experiences of specific organizations. And Bayo and his colleagues did one of our case studies for us, and he has some interesting findings for us in terms of what they've been learning from working with CBOs. So Bayo.
Great, thanks for the warm introduction. One, as he stated, I'm Bayo, I'm project manager at Energy Trust, and I will be talking about best practices for state energy agencies working with communities. And some of this will be...
Hey, Bayo, if I could interrupt, we're having a sound problem again.
Oh, okay.
How about now? Is that
Better? That's perfect.
Great. Thanks, Warren. I'll restart. As Warren said, I'm Bayo, and I am here to talk about some best practices that state energy agencies can implement when working with communities or community organizations, tribal governments, etc. Some of this will be a little bit of a review of what uh, Leon, Mr. Leon and Dr. Knox Hayes said in their presentations, and some of it will be new. Next slide, please. So it's important for us to remember our why. Why do we want to develop relationships with communities, community organizations? What is the benefit of that? Well, we do it because it works. Successful relationships build successful projects. The frameworks are more durable, participation in programs and projects is higher, and the programs are better received by the community regardless of their success according to numerical metrics. And stronger projects lead to stronger relationships, which in turn leads back to stronger future projects, and the cycle continues. Next slide, please. It's important for us to remember when we are engaging in a new project to do our homework before we actually engage with partners, potential partners. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from the things that we have already done in the past, whether it's at our own agencies or agencies that we have partnered with, or agencies that are in our networks, whether it's in another state or a different agency in the same state. And also, we should research before we engage. Every community is different, and there's a lot of wealth of information that we have at hand before we work with them. That could be talking with our colleagues in our own departments, reading reports on the websites of any entities that we will be working with, which can be found on their websites or in a library, depending on what information you're looking for. And speaking of that, looking at the history of that community or of that entity, such as a tribal nation or the Black community in Milwaukee or any area around the country. And also start collaborating internally before collaborating externally. There are multiple programs that might want to work with the community that you want to work with. Instead of those individual program leads going to those community organizations or entities individually, we can combine our forces and go to them as a collective, which makes it easier for the community especially, and easier for us in the long term, as that creates more synergy. Next slide. Thank you. As Leon stated earlier, it's important for us to keep it custom. As I said in the previous slide, we should build on what we already know, but also we shouldn't assume that just because there are some similarities between one group with another, that everything is the same. There might be there's always some demographic difference that most likely needs to be taken into account. Instead, we should take the broad lessons and the frameworks that we have implemented previously and adapt them when possible. And when that isn't possible, we should work to create new ones. This is a great time when developing those new frameworks and lessons and mechanisms to do so with the entity with whom you would like to work. And so some stuff you can plan at the beginning, and some stuff you can plan later on in the process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And it is very important for us to, one slide back, I'm almost done with that one. Thank you. And the last point on this slide is I would like to impress upon us the importance of keeping things locally appropriate. And not only is that regards to how we engage in the community, but also making sure that all parties involved are getting what they want to get out of a project out of it. We might have an idea of what might be beneficial to an entity or a community, but the only way to know for sure is to ask. And also, it's important for us to allow creative solutions that comes from a diverse team. Those ideas are often more durable and lasting than those that are often created individually instead of collectively. Next slide. Thank you. We must engage our partners really as soon as we can. As one said, sometimes there are just logistical impediments to engaging partners as early as possible, or is at the very beginning. But we should do so as early as possible, and definitely in the planning stages. And they should be involved regardless of their role, whether they are an active partner or a lead or just a consultant. And we're not going to solve global warming with any one program. And that's okay because, well, we don't have a ton of time to do it. However, we should still start small with our projects and build over time. It should be done as an iterative process during which we periodically assess the project internally and with our external team, and also check that success with the community at large, because the team only has access to certain members of the community, as a colleague, Oriana Maniera, stated previously. And the best way to know success is to go to the individuals who we are trying to support. And the last point on this slide is just to keep it flexible. The reason for this is that it allows for unforeseen challenges, which will inevitably occur. And we can, if we're flexible, use those challenges to improve the current project, and if not, to make improvements and take some lessons to improve the project that we'll do in the future. Next slide. I'll try to speed up because I know we're running out of time. Okay, we must always come into these projects with a mindset of honor and respect. We should honor those relationships, the capacity, the knowledge, whether it's technical, historical, or social, that the entire team brings to bear. That's because everyone is an expert in something, and we all have unique and invaluable roles to play in a partnership. That being said, one of the best assets that state agencies have is their capacity. They have more funding, more staff, more resources to do a lot of that heavy lifting, and they should be. We should offer that freely to ensure that the work is equitably distributed, not necessarily equally distributed, because those aren't, as we know, aren't always the same. I just want to hit on this specific point of honoring tribal sovereignty. Tribal nations are not ethnic groups or community-based organizations. They are political entities on par with other nations, and they communicate with the federal government, not just with state governments. And as Eugene Strobridge stated in his case study, when tribal governments when their sovereignty isn't recognized, that's when it becomes eroded. And we all have a part to play to ensure that is maintained. Which speaks to my last point of acknowledging the power dynamics that are inherent in all partnerships. This is especially the case when money changes hands. And in that point, there is an assumption that money will change hands. All of us get paid for the work that we do. As Dr. Knox Hayes stated, some CBOs really rely on volunteers, and that financial capacity is limited, and we should pay them for the work that they're doing, the expertise that they're bringing to bear. And lastly, sometimes energy agencies are in the passenger seat, sometimes they're in the driver's seat, and sometimes they're they're just watching the car go by. And it's important for us to really, in the beginning and throughout, plan and maintain a clear understanding of what our roles are, and make sure that we are not overstepping what we agree to, and that we empower our partners in our team organizations to grow, to be able to complete their own projects independent of our support and our resources, if they would like to. Last slide. Really quickly, I would like to show you all of the resources, and thank the authors that drafted these. As I said earlier, Eugene Strobridge of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, Anna Zi and Matt Olaf of Clean Energy States Alliance, Lydia Garcia, and the team at Energy Trust, where I work. All of these resources can be found on CESA's website. And I want to recognize CESA as well and applaud their efforts in this work. CESA is a national leader in expanding solar for underserved communities, and their work can't be overstated. And lastly, I want to highlight that the people that are in these, that have drafted these case studies, these are the experts. And also, those of us who are in this webinar are also experts, colleagues and experts. And the purpose of Solar with Justice is to learn from each other. And we should continue to do this beyond this project. I'm sure you can reach out to anyone listed on this page, myself, because it's to make better projects, we should collaborate and not reinvent the wheel, as I stated earlier. Thank you for your time.
Hey, thanks very much, Bio. I really appreciate it. And we have only 4 minutes left, so I have one question for you and one question for Janelle. Janelle, you talked about some of the things that came out of the survey that were unexpected, and some of the responses that you were surprised about. But was there something that you thought was likely to be a result that the survey responses reinforced and basically, in a sense, proved that your initial assumption was right about CBOs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea maybe that solar isn't the primary area of work, like that, maybe that shouldn't, I kind of anticipated that would be the case, that it's actually, I think it gets into this idea that resilience, a lot of people think resilience is just environmental. Like when we use that word, we're thinking about environmental goals and environmental objectives. And really it's not just environmental, it's a lot of different social objectives and goals are tied to environmental resilience. And so I think that the idea that most organizations, or what we termed solar adjacent, which our survey proved kind of, demonstrated, and are pursuing a range of different kinds of social resilience in environmental resilience, the fact that that's all synergized and operating together was reinforced, but kind of expected in the study.
Good, thank you. And my one question for you, Bio, you gave a sense of the principles involved in working with CBOs, but to give a sense of the flavor of the actual work you've been doing at Energy Trust, could you briefly describe one specific program you've done that has involved CBOs?
Yeah, sure. One program that I did was Solar and BIPOC Solar Ambassadors, which is a project largely funded by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, to build a curriculum, and a team of community-based organizations in the Portland metro area and Energy Trust developed and taught to community members that represented different areas of the Portland metro area on residential solar, what it is, and what its benefits are, and how to adopt it. That was really helpful in really having something that we can share with share across the country for other agencies who would like to use it. But also, it really strengthened our and built new relationships that we had with that team that
Hey,
we are continuing to work with.
Hey, thanks very much to both of you, and I've appreciated all your efforts over the past several years on the Solar with Justice project. The project's coming to end officially, but all the material will continue to live on our website. We at CESA will remain keenly interested in this topic and continue to believe that close coordination between state energy agencies and community-based organization is crucial. So thanks everybody for joining us today, and we hope you'll look at some of our materials. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you, Warren.
Thanks, Warren.